a program, Andover Newton Theological School in Boston, which was a joint program with Boston University. The interesting thing about that program that became a real gift to me is that all of the faculty were CPE supervisors, Jungian analysts, and actively participating in CPE. And I knew nothing about CPE. So when I arrived, I found out that in the 2 years or so that I was there, that there'd be 3 or 4 units of CPE required, and we were off and running. I learned group theory from a professor, but by sitting in a group of 40 people, unstructured group. We then, after having the group, we talked about the reading material and the theory of how you function in groups. At the same time, when I first, toward the end of that program, began doing some supervision, I was asked to write verbatim on my supervisory conferences. We, in a full-time unit in the summer, we met every morning. The supervisory staff did, and talked about students. I had to come prepared to describe what I was doing with them in detail in supervisory conference and be ready to talk about why I was doing that and how it connected to the theory that we were learning in the program. We don't have anything these days that really parallels that kind of educational process. We rely on our supervisors in different parts of the country to create curriculum. One of the things, I happen to be the academy chair, and as a committee and with the direction from some of the work groups in certification, we are looking at creating a core curriculum, a national core curriculum that would help supervisors across the country have at least something that they can use or choose to use if they want for their SESs at all different levels. So that got me thinking about talking about supervisory conference, because I don't know how often we expect our SESs to know what's supposed to happen there. Now, you who sent me in a response, we have a variety of different approaches to supervisory conference. Some folks don't have them. As a matter of fact, I talked to a supervisor last week who said, well, I don't even do that anymore. I mix group and I mix supervisory conference all together. I don't ever talk to my students just one-on-one. And behind that was some concern about whether that would be appropriate or not. So there is a wide range of understanding of what they would be for. What you've told me is that the goal, 4 of you, and there were about 8 or 9 responses. Out of that, 4 of you told me that supervisory alliance and building the supervisory rapport was a key issue. The other biggest one had to do with either spiritual care goals or goals of the unit. There were 4 of you that said that was key. There were only 2 people who made a reference to one. Connie said that observing the student having an ability to observe themselves and their own dynamics and to assess themselves was important there. And attention to family dynamics and any blocks or roles that the person had that were still operative was another concern of a different person. Now, what we talked about didn't always match what our goals were. We talked, 4 or 5 people talked about either talking about verbatims or talking about relationships with patients and staff. Peer group, a couple people mentioned student goals, which was really the largest of the categories above. There were only 2 people who said that that was something that they talked about. Not long ago, when Amy Green came to the Cleveland Clinic, I was the director, she was the director of CPE. We decided to do a couple units together to see how our styles meshed. One of the places that they didn't mesh very well was around supervisory conference. And I think there are some clinic folks online today, they probably experienced this firsthand. Amy often talks about verbatims. And that's sometimes the primary activity, as I understand it, in her conversations with folks. They would then come to me and I would supervise them and said, I don't really want to talk to you about your verbatims. So, and you'll hear more about this as we go along. But that was, I think, shows us that we come at this from lots of different places. I want to talk a little bit about a supervisor that I had who was the person requiring me to talk about theory and about supervisory conference. It was Ed Springer in Boston, and here's what he said the purpose was. Find out where students have made core decisions about themselves and about their life. Find out whether there are any blocks there, and you can find out where the strengths are. He was particularly focused on the blocks. And then he said the purpose of supervisory conference is to camp out there around those blocks. Now, my desire in thinking about this, I wanted to theologize about that experience, and he had some of that as well. Another event that captured my attention about supervisory conference was several years ago. There was a study that said that students 6 months after having had a good CPE experience, they self-identified as it being a good CPE experience. 6 months after the program, they were back doing ministry exactly the same way as they had done it before they started CPE. When I saw that study, that bothered me, and then got me to start questioning, well, what is the impact of CPE? Obviously, what is the purpose? What are we doing that might need to be adjusted? Or are we going to be, if that's adult, those are adult students and that's what they choose, we leave it alone. Just what is the impact on us if we understand that? And so for me, the purpose of supervisory conference then became identifying these core issues that I began to call covenants with God, that are issues and core issues and decision values that really are so much a part of the fabric of who we are that we haven't evaluated them very much. Out of them comes our definition of ministry, our styles in ministry, and our roles in ministry. I believe that to be true. And therefore, if it is, and those covenants don't change in the course of a unit, it's not a surprise then that the style of ministry and the ways of approaching pastoral care or spiritual care is not going to change. So for me, then, that leads me to say that dealing with a person's covenants with God is what supervisory conference is about. So let me tell you a little bit about covenants. If you want to read more about them at some point, my book, Promise of the Soul, you can get it probably now for about 90 cents on Amazon. It's spelled out there. But covenants are those life principles or prayers by which we choose to live. They influence our decision-making and how we understand ourselves, others, and God. Here's the reality, and has been my experience, is that when we have these basic principles, and you can describe them in family systems theory, you can describe them in a wide variety of other ways in terms of development theory. When, however, those principles are tied to spirituality and religious practice, then they grow in their power in our lives exponentially. And they become the most difficult thing to change. And they become the most necessary thing to change if we intend to impact people's spiritual care. And of course, that's a choice. We have to decide. And this brings me to some questions about our standards have really worked hard at outcomes. But I'm not sure we spent enough time talking about what the outcome is for what we do. What do we really want to have happen as people come out of CPE? And again, there are a variety of answers and questions to that. It seems to me that if we don't change or help a person understand and free up from covenants that are restrictive and often inflexible, and part of the reason they're inflexible is that they haven't been examined, and some, because of trauma in life and as we grow, they have kept us alive. And then as we come into ministry and we grow older, they stop being as effective for us as they have been in the past. Covenants, to be effective and to build on their strengths, need to be flexible and grace-filled. They need to grow as we need to grow. So if people are in CPE, and if you're wondering why people sometimes react so strongly to us challenging their faith or challenging their basic principles in their faith, it often comes from understanding these covenants within themselves. So just to show you a little bit about that, because I'm Lutheran and things only come in threes, and because I have a simple mind and can only handle about three things, I generalize my assessment of students personality-wise in three areas. One is a giver. Giver is a person that you may understand easily, just puts their needs last to other people's needs, puts other people's needs first. Their challenge and their blessing, actually, if they can do it, is to find their own voice and to speak for themselves. Their covenant is often, as long as I help, care, nurture, then I know God will care for me, protect me, whatever it might be. Second, I would put in the category of wanter achievers, people who are goal-driven. If you know something about the Enneagram, then they might be threes or eights. And it is their challenge very often is to understand their own role and to be available and vulnerable, to show themselves, much like a giver does naturally. And for them, it's as long as I work hard, hold integrity, succeed, God will hold me, be proud of me, etc. The last area is a searcher. Their challenge block often, or their blessing, is commitment. They are usually exciting. They can be charismatic. They're excited about trying new things. They can come into CPE very excited, but they seem not to go down the path of really committing to something. And often that's their covenant. As long as I explore, I try all options, God will hold me as special. Now, for a searcher, a true searcher, they haven't really come to understand that there's freedom in commitment. There's only freedom as you avoid commitment, very often is the process. So Ed Springer, as he talked about camping out, then leads me to think that supervisory conference then becomes the campground, and group is then the playground. It's the place where we practice. My students, some of them who are on the line, historically get really tired, I think, of me and have said to me, are you still going to talk to me about that covenant stuff? We haven't left that covenant stuff. And that's true. Until I begin to see in action a giver, for example, who overcommits to patients, who has difficulty creating boundaries with patients, who certainly don't want to confront them, who are worried about them being hurt by a chaplain, by a nurse, by a doctor. Very often that's a covenant that has been formed around some kind of abuse. That would not be unusual. I begin to look for what that might be. and we can begin then to talk about ministry in a different way and how to do ministry. If we can talk about what leads to such a firm commitment to helping someone. With a wanter achiever, if it's somebody who will only is valuing themselves if they provide for others, work hard and provide for others, what is that about? Where does that come from? Now, we have all of these styles in all of us, but a primary one that usually directs our decision making and certainly helps us define ministry in the ways that we do. Searchers, calling them to a given path is what's going to be helpful to them. So, talking about, we don't often talk about, I don't think in my hearing anyway, a theory of change around supervision. But if you are going to talk about any kind of a thing that you're going to camp out with people at the places where they are least likely to change, then some conversation about change seems to me to be important. So do your theories include changing? Is it solely the responsibility of the student, the adult learner? Do you intervene? How do you intervene? And are you intervening to get some basic core issue change, or do you leave that alone? And again, my colleagues vary widely on this issue. Some, if they see an issue like a quotes core issue that I've been talking about, that's a direct line to therapy. And of course, that leads us to the old thing in CPE. Well, that's the difference between therapy and supervision. I have always thought that is a false distinction, partly because before therapy started in the 1920s, it was always ministers in ministry who got the questions that we want to send to therapy now. I think that there are certainly reasons to send somebody into therapy. And I recommend a book, if you can find it. It's the only book I've ever seen written about pastoral referral by Bill Oglesby, who's former president of ACPE. And I think in that book does a great job of saying, when do you refer to things like therapy? The interesting thing about the book is it's not an issue-based thing. So it's not send them to therapy if you see abuse, or if you see separation anxiety, or if you see attachment disorder. No, they send when you don't have the time to deal with the issue, or send when it's not something you know much about. Or so it's an excellent book if you can find it, and I think you can find it out there. But I have always believed that therapy, if we're going to have a discussion about the difference between therapy and supervision, then we better define our terms. And we better talk about what therapy is. Therapy is not issue-based. Therapy is contract-based, much like supervision is, at least from my point of view. So, talking about what needs to change, what our role in it, what the supervisor's role in it is important, and how long, this is my favorite topic, how long does it take to change? And it is whenever I talk like this or talk about these issues with people, they say, we can't do that kind of change in a unit. You can't even probably approach the changing in a year. My response to that is, well, what is your understanding of how long it takes to change? And for me, I equate change with conversion. Looking at the world in a different way. When the world all of a sudden, surprisingly to us, looks different than it did the moment before. So these are the two principles I believe about change. Change can happen in an instant. It's when the confluence of my understanding of myself and a caring person come together, and I go, oh, I never thought of it that way, or wow, that's possible for me. Those are the moments when change can happen, and it comes that quickly. Now, part of what I believe about change can take an instant. It may take a lifetime to live into it. But you're living into a different world. The world is not the same any longer. And then this last thing that I have to always think about when I say it is when the pain of staying the same is equal to or greater than the pain of changing, change can happen. When the pain of staying the same is equal to or greater than the pain of changing, then change can happen. So that makes me wonder sometimes how much pain we offer in CPE to help balance those scales so the change can happen. And we probably offer plenty of pain already. So but it's something to talk about. Last point I'd make about change. I think there's a couple more here, but I want to emphasize when we are talking about the core issues of people and they have spirituality or religious practice connected to them, we are in the realm of the sacred. And we need to tread lightly with care and with an understanding of our own dynamics and the dynamics of the student. This is very often asking someone to understand themselves with God differently before they can quite understand their relationship with God in a different way, is fraught with fear and concern and anxiety for the student. And it needs to be dealt with great care. I was lecturing to a group of lay ministers last week and giving them a little bit about covenants, and they thought it was really interesting. And they came up very quickly with their covenants. And then when I said it is in breaking our covenant that new freedom is found, that's where they got stuck. Whoa, why would I break that covenant? That covenant has kept me alive, that has served me, it has sent me into ministry. So we are in the area of the sacred. In order for us to grow, covenants need to be flexible and grace-filled and willing to change as we change and as it is necessary for us to change. And it seems to me that focusing on anything else in supervision seems to undermine the learning alliance and actually learning itself. If some of the research that I've talked about has any truth to it, then if we don't pay attention to these core values, these core covenants that define ministry for the person, then we don't attend to them and the person leaves, it is not a surprise then that they'll be doing ministry exactly like they were doing it before they took CPE from us. I think we need to find out more about this area. And we've got a $4.5 million grant that George Fischette and others is overseeing. If in your centers you haven't applied for those grants, I think the deadline is January 29th. Please do. This is an opportunity for us to take a look at our product, what we want our product to be, and to see what happens. Several years ago, Sheila Hammond and I did a research process, and we won the Research Center of the Year award for it. What we used was the Association of Theological Schools Readiness for Ministry instrument, which had 25 years of history to it. And we partnered that with the affective sensitivity test that we used out of Michigan State. It was developed by Michigan State. So to test the sensitivity of people pre-CPE and post-CPE. We got some surprises in that test. One of them, which we could explain, we thought, was that people became less sensitive at the end of a CPE unit. Now, we were in a psychiatric hospital, and we found that Michigan State graded the test for us. We found, excuse me, that they were too free-floating and too over-committing to patients. It's not unusual even in many of our centers. And at the end of the unit, they had gotten more proper boundaries, and we think that led to the fact that they showed less sensitivity on the test. But we haven't done much of that work, and I encourage us to do that. I believe doing it will send us back to reconsider what the basic purposes of supervisory conference are, and the basic purposes of CPE and what the outcomes would be. I'm excited about that, and I hope that the centers will apply for it. They are looking for proposals, and they're willing to fund it. So we, much like I wanted to close and handle some of your questions, much like we track group process, I wanted to give you some steps that I think we can track in supervisory conference. And we begin with setting goals, as many of you talked about. Now, when I'm setting goals, as you see in parentheses, I'm looking for covenants. And that's, I have some colleagues who, yes, kind of do goals, but they don't pay a lot of attention. My two favorite categories is I'm going to lose weight during this, and I'm going to improve my spiritual meditation during my CPE unit. I find that both of those things usually fall apart in the CPE unit. So, but I don't believe that, I think they're a way to hide some of the real work that has to happen. So I spend significant amount of time. I sometimes go as far as 3 weeks before I agree on the goal. Obviously, people are inexperienced very often in what CPE is and how it might affect them, but I encourage them, and I am looking for those core values that might show up. And I believe that building the supervisory alliance and program investment is really important in the first part of a unit. And here's why. If we don't deal with investment issues early, you're going to be dealing with them for the whole unit. I appreciated Alice sent me her things, and she was saying, you know, I'm not quite sure what these students are telling me is really resistance, or how to find what it is exactly. I would say anytime we're concerned about students who are asking us questions and asking us to tell them how to do ministry as a starter, although that's very natural, when they don't turn assignments in on time, when they come late to groups, all of that for me become investment issues. And if they're not dealt with early, then you're going to be unhappy the whole unit, and the supervisory student is going to be unhappy as well. It's one of the reasons why, for relatively inexperienced supervisors, the final evaluation sometimes has material in it that the student hasn't heard before, and that gets everybody unhappy. But it's because those early issues need to be called. Now, how you call them, it's up to your theory. And I'm a transformational education supervisor. I have a tendency to be direct and to say, to call behavior when I see it, and to ask students about behavior, not just to challenge the fact they haven't turned something in, but to ask them, talk to me about why you're having trouble turning this material in. So, but that fits whatever style you happen to have. The second thing is, as the midpoint or less comes in on supervisory conference, I'm hoping that we, the student and I together, have come to some identification of the covenants, these life principles and values, and we have talked about how they're helpful to us and how we have talked about how they are not helpful to us. One of the key issues is that the very process of talking about them goes a very long way, I believe, in helping a person rethink their ministry. And so changing the covenants with God, for me becomes the heading toward one of the close of a unit, and becomes again a conversation. If it's sequential units and it's a residency year, I'm still having those questions as that unit ends, even whether it's the second, third, or fourth unit. How is it with you and God? How is it with you and your covenants and commitments to God? How has it changed? If you wrote your covenant now, would it look differently and than it did before? A really underappreciated area, I think, is the last stage or step in supervisory conference, and that's helping that person say goodbye to this experience. It is an easy thing, and I've done that, to kind of slide by it, particularly if we're going to see the students in a next unit. But I was taught, I think, well, that if you want to be free to invest in the next experience, then you need to say goodbye to the previous one. And the way you say goodbye is to say what the meaning was for you, the meaning in the relationships, the meaning in the group experience, and the meaning of the learning and how it has impacted you, send you forth then to open up and be more open in the next experience than you would have been if you hadn't said goodbye. Okay. It is time for questions, and I think I hear that I have to get out of my PowerPoint to enable me to see your questions. So, and let's make sure I get back to the screen. Okay, Mark, if you're on and you can hear me, let's see. So from Bob McGinney, I did not hear you talk about student readiness and wondered how you assess that. I assume, Bob, you mean readiness to have these kinds of conversations. If you're talking about readiness for CPE, I think that's an interview thing and you shouldn't take them. But yes, readiness is an issue. Very often students are frightened by conversations about covenants. And so that's something I think that we need to go with the student and have a sense that what they can handle and what they can't handle. Now, that doesn't mean I stop asking or I stop finding a different way to talk to the student about their relationship with God and their commitments and how that impacts their definition of ministry. I still do that. Michelle, say more about building supervisory alliance and program investment. Well, I think the first thing, Michelle, we've got to do is look for the behaviors that speak to lack of investment. And that could be either over fearfulness or over assertiveness on the part of the student. Or resistance. What I've found recently is that supervisors have a tendency to see those behaviors and they seem to hope that they're going to work out as they get into CPE. I don't believe that to be the case. I believe it needs attention. Now, how you give it attention, as I said, is up to your theory, but I think at the very least, and one of the most effective things is that you have people come in and you say, please come see me in my office, and say, can you tell me about what's going on with you and why you're turning your papers in late? And that's an outside of a regularly scheduled meeting, and that at the very least gets them aware that you are both now talking about these things at the very least. And so that's an example. If you want to follow up, that's fine. Crystal asks, what is the balance between the work of the supervisor and the work of the students? It sounds like your theory guides your work as the supervisor, which seems more direct than other supervisory styles and theories. It has been mentioned to me that my supervisory style, Crystal, is direct, yes. So I think that that is a great question. It's a question that Amy Green and I at the Cleveland Clinic asked ourselves, and I know she asks that question quite a bit. And when I err with this very intentional style, I probably am going to err more on working harder than the student might work. But that is part of the awareness. It doesn't change the fact working harder than the student, it doesn't change the questions I ask. The work is the student's. I can't force the student. It's one of the changes from my early days as a supervisor. I can't force a student, obviously, to change, but I can hold, and as this came from Ed Springer, I have to say, all those years ago, I do camp out at the point where I believe their resistance is or their fear is, and so I will ask the same questions. And because here's the theory. The theory is that if these things don't change, they're not going to learn anything. So now I'm wide open on how you might do that, but attending to it is vitally important. If you don't attend to it, so let's say the student is showing resistance. This gets back to Bob's question too. If you don't attend to it or you don't ask the questions, then the chances of nothing happening with the student, or here are the two, adaptation happening with students or nothing, then everybody seems to me to be wasting their time. So you don't have to do it the way I do it, which is often very direct, but attending to the question when you see it, I think is very important. Connie is asking what types of, and Crystal, if you want to follow up, that's fine. What types of questions do you get at to get at the commitments? You listed 3 commitments. Seems that there are more. Well, Connie, now I'm Lutheran, so I can only hold so many things. So when you're talking about the Enneagram, for example, and there are 9 things and there are wings to them, my mind just turns into bacon. So that's partly me. There are many different kinds of commitments. I've done a lot of study on personality typing, and the 3 I've chosen are sort of a composite of what I've studied over the years. And yes, there are different ways, but the commitments, so here's the type of questions in answer to your first part of it. Do you have a prayer that you say is each day that guides you, that you want to live by, or a value? And usually about 70% in a room, and I've done this with upwards of 300 people at the same time, 70% of the people know exactly what I'm talking about as soon as I ask the question. About 30% or so don't. And what I say to those who are a little confused about it, I say, well, what would this guiding principle be if you had to make one? And that gives us, so that's the first thing. The second question I ask, which is equally important, is what is the worst thing that you could do that would break that covenant or that value, that principle? When you get those 2 questions, I think that begins to give you a composite of both what drives them and what they're fearful of, and how those covenants are restrictive. And that gives us a beginning. Janison says, I think I pronounced that correctly, please say more about how you understand entering the realm of the sacred with the students, especially with a diverse student body with different faiths and cultures. Well, Janison, I think it starts with significant respect. And it's why I use the phrase, we're in the realm of the sacred. When we're asking people about their basic life values, their spiritual values, it can be frightening, and it's certainly, or people get defensive, even in the very general asking. But if you ask in the way that I just mentioned, do you have, even inquiring, do you have a basic covenant or prayer rather that you try to live by? Then I think we're underway. And I think that's a question that goes across diverse student body. I mean, I've supervised in several parts of the country, San Francisco included, and I had the biggest diverse group of students that you possibly can imagine. You know, from conservative Christians to liberal Christians, Wiccan, Buddhists, Muslims, African spirituality, and anything you can imagine we had in San Francisco. But the questions remain the same. Do you have a spiritual value by which you try to live? And what is the thing that would break that value? So I think that that's both a respective, it doesn't cause us to have to be particularly cautious around those questions, because I happen to believe that all people have those things in them, whether they call them spiritual or not. I've used this with hospital administrators and nurses, some of whom were atheists or agnostics and would no more have thought about spirituality than anything else, but they knew the value they were trying to live by, and they could talk about that. Crystal, follow up. Thanks for your response. I tend to be direct, and the balance for me is finding the balance between doing the work or facilitating the work environment for learning. And this feels like a constant tension. Yes, it is. I think, again, our work is to hold our values. And values for me are to present to the students questions that I think will help inform their ministry. Now, I learned a long time ago, and from a couple mentors, you know, it's the old phrase, not being tied to the outcome. It's one of my relationships with ACPE, that I often make my opinion known, and the only way I can do that and not be frustrated that I'm not being heard or whatever, or people aren't doing what I want, is I'm going to say my opinion, but I'm not tied to the outcome, because the outcome is certainly bigger than me, and it involves, you know, 300 or 400 supervisors and an organization. And I think that's how you strike the balance. If you know, one of the ways, the first things I would encourage all of us to do is look at our own covenants with God. If we are driving too hard, if we don't know our own covenant, and it's guiding us to really work and work and work, then our covenant is too restrictive and keeps us in too tight a form and needs a little grace, just as the students do. Other comments or questions? Patrick, how do you think about the relationship between student learning goals and their covenants? Does this work with explicit? Boy, you talk really well. In the contract development. Patrick, I think that's a great question. I think that the students, especially early in a CPE experience, will not immediately identify covenant things, because, and partly I wait for a while until their feet are on the ground before I talk about these kinds of principles. I have tried to give them this material before they came in, and they still don't hear it until later in the experience. So I gently, as much as I can, encourage them to write goals that are at their growing edges as they understand them at this point. And I think that if they're not quite there, I might push a little or say, can you look at this differently? Trying to get at what I know sound like covenant areas. But that sometimes is a process. If I think the student is being open to learning and is at least open to hearing about this kind of thing, then I think we're okay. And we move along and get at more in depth. It's also a reason why I re-goal it at midterms very often. I think it's important to re-goal at midterms, especially now that at that point, students who haven't had much experience in CPE now have some, and they can understand some of what you're talking about, even the language. I mean, we have language that we use that is foreign to some students. So I do think that it's my work at that point to try and help them identify goals that are open at that point. Thanks. Crystal. Therapy and supervision. Can you say more about that in regards to transformation theory? Well, as I said, Crystal, I have always thought, and students get asked this in certification process quite often, about the difference between therapy and supervision. And I have always thought it's a false distinction. Because normally we say that's we define therapy as topics, and very often, not always, but very often. And I don't think therapy is topics. Therapy is a particular contract for change, actually. I think supervision, in my theory, in transformational theory, is a contract for change. But it's not, the difference is the student is not identifying it initially. Therapy, a student identifies an issue, walks into therapy and says, I want to work on this. And there's other differences. But so I try, if I run into an issue that I think is really important, I rarely hesitate to talk about it. Or I try to talk about it when the student is ready to talk about it. So if they, well, let me say, I'm trying to think of a way particularly to say this to distinguish. So if you have, I don't normally, if I feel like this is a deep enough issue that I'm not going to have time to deal with it, or that the group is going to be overwhelmed by it, or it's going to take too much time in the group, I recommend therapy right away. So I think those are better principles to decide the distinction between therapy and supervision. I think you can talk about anything in supervision, and you can have a good outcome about talking about it, but not if the student's not willing to go there, not if you've not ever seen it before, and not if you don't have time and can boundary it properly. But I think it's much more the process than it is topic, if that helps. Susan, your theory seems resonant with Robert Kegan's hidden commitments. That's true. Have you read this or done some thinking about how his ideas might dialogue with your own? I have briefly. It's been a while since I've looked at it, and I think there are there's some similarities, and I think that it is our covenant, my phrasing, our covenants with God, or the hidden commitments that we have, are why we have difficulty in changing. So I agree, and I think he talks about a similar dynamic. So I would say yes to that, and I think that I haven't specifically. You asked, have you done some thinking about how his ideas might dialogue with your own? I don't know enough about his stuff to answer that, but I know enough to say that I think we're talking about a very similar dynamic, and I think that we have a bigger issue than he's talking about, and that is that when those interior commitments or covenants are actually hooked to spirituality, their power grows exponentially. So it's a challenge, and but I think it's a vital challenge for CPE and for us. Got about 5 more minutes. A question, Jonathan. What are your thoughts about one distinction between therapy and supervision, being that in supervision, the supervisor tries to raise issues that more or less directly relate to the student becoming a competent spiritual caregiver, or even just the outcomes rather than general life issues? You know, I really like that question. I think it is where we have trended in CPE. I've been around long enough. I've been doing this 45 years. It's not where we started, Jonathan. And this distinction, although it was still there in different parts of the country, and in different parts of the country dealt with therapy and supervision differently, I think we have become much more focused, and it's been our guide on therapy to say, if you're not talking about spiritual care issues, then you're not doing the outcomes. But keep in mind what I said earlier. What I believe defines people's ministry and the way they do ministry is their interior values and covenants. So if I believe that, or something like that, and I don't start with them and pay attention to them, then I'm not doing my job. So because I do believe they define ministry, and here's the other thing, that if we don't pay attention to them, and Keegan echoes this, that if we don't pay attention to them, people won't change. So I have had some concern about our outcomes becoming more and more focused primarily on pastoral care, spiritual care skills. But I would say, and I'm glad we still have things in there, outcomes in there about knowing life issues and knowing oneself, because I believe that it's in the knowing oneself outcome type things that we actually can change our way of doing ministry. Lori, I'm curious if you have the students share their goals and covenants in the peer group, and can you speak to the way you balance the work in group and individual around the covenants? I have done that, Lori. Yes, I often do it in a seminar when I introduce the concepts and ask them to share theirs. And in that doing, then covenants become a part of the language of the group when they have talked about it and they've worked on it and they've presented them. Yes, so I think it's a good idea to present them. So your last part of the question is, how do you balance the work in the group and individual among the covenants? I believe that supervision, as I indicated in the processes or in one of the other slides, I actually seed the group in the conversations that we have. When somebody has a covenant or finds out that there was some kind of an event in their life that led to that particular covenant, I encourage it to be shared in the group. And somebody else sent that as a principle as well, is that whatever is talked about in supervision, they encourage to go to the group. And that's much more my tendency is to do. Because I think in community and sharing in community is where the freedom most is going to be. Very often that starts in supervisory conference because many times it's safer there with one person. So, Connie, I have a student who's very focused on thanks, hope, and focusing on the positive. Yes. He has a hard time being with struggles. I'm suspecting his covenant might be as long as I praise God. Yep. You are probably got it nailed, Connie. I think that a lot of students who are, as you say, so focused, they have a fear. What I would say is, what is the worst thing you could do? I asked the student, what is the worst thing you could do to break this commitment of thanks, hope, and positive? And if you can get at it from that perspective, I call that the promise breaker, the covenant breaker. And it is that's very revealing very often, and is an avenue to start talking about things, or saying to that student, what do you think will happen if you don't do that? And they'll find out they're trying to control life. They're probably trying to control the way God is. They believe in a God who is going to punish based upon how we react and how we talk. So you're on it, and I think coming at it from the what are you afraid of and what would break this, I think, is another way to get at it. Krister, do you have any thoughts about the idea of doing individual supervision primarily in the group context? Another one of my favorite topics, Krister. I think that I think we ought to do individual supervision in individual supervision. And I think we ought to encourage the students to bring whatever issues we talk about into the group so that they own it and the group can help them with it. There is a tendency, if it's new material that comes up, I don't have a problem with the supervisor being the primary person interacting there. My group theory starts with the supervisor being active and at the end being less active. So by teaching, I think one of the most important things that happen in group is that the supervisor early on in the group life shows students what the key issues are that what the key issues are in the most affective and the most important to deal with, and then the group takes over from there. And I think the supervisor needs to back up off that after that. Getting into this intense individual supervision in a group, I think, is probably not the best place to do it. It's the best to do it in individual supervision. Anonymous viewer, glad you've begun this kind. I appreciate your focusing on individual supervisory conference. It'd be great to have others share their theories about IS and other academy. Yes, I agree, and I appreciate your thought, and I appreciate people's commitment. Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of our time. So thank you, Dennis, and thanks everybody for participating. This webinar was recorded, and we will be making it available on the ACPE Academy webpage, along with a link to the PowerPoint slides so that you can review and see everything that was there. And we appreciate everybody's participation today. And please be on the lookout for future webinars coming from the Academy. And wishing everybody a wonderful day and a wonderful holiday. Take care.